Okay, here we go again. I'm still finishing up chapter 10, but I went through a lot of Ohio stuff in detail that's not in the book. I know it's very important because it's tested on, so sorry for the lengthiness here, but all right, so I am picking up on termination of agency, and this is page 177 of your book. Read through the different types of terminations of agency. The best way is basically completion or performance fulfillment of the objective. So if you've signed a listing agreement with a seller or a buyer representation agreement with a buyer, and the seller sells and closes or the buyer buys and closes, then that's the best type of way to terminate an agency relationship, because the actual act has been satisfied and completed. Death or incapacity of one of the parties will terminate an agency relationship. So if you have a listing agreement with a seller and the seller passes away, that listing agreement is terminated. Okay, that's important to know. Signed contracts on houses, if somebody dies, is not terminated, but a listing agreement creating an agency relationship where there's no signed contract automatically terminates by operation of law upon the death or incapacity of either party. Also, if the broker loses his license, that listing agreement is automatically terminated. Then agency relationship can be terminated by renunciation or by revocation. I don't see those words actually in your textbook, but I think those are used on the test. Renunciation is really where it is terminated by the agent or the broker, and that may be for a lot of different reasons. I'm not sure. If a seller is, or you have a client that is not really acting with integrity, and perhaps you're just don't really want to deal with them, you might try to just say, hey, we're going to part ways here. And again, if the broker or agent is terminating, that's called renunciation. Remember, a listing agreement is a binding contract. It's for a period of time, again, in this area, usually for 6 months. But most people do not sue over somebody backing out of a listing agreement. First off, if somebody backs away from a listing agreement, it is if it's the agent or broker, if it's the seller or buyer that backs away from it, it is the broker that has to sue. You as an agent can't sue. And again, we've talked about this. Brokers do not want to be known to be suing their customers and clients and potential customers and clients. So it has to be usually a pretty egregious situation before a broker will agree to sue. But anyway, if an agent or broker wants to walk away and parts ways and terminates an agency a relationship or agreement, that's called renunciation. And if the seller or buyer walks away, that's called revocation. So it's kind of like an Indian giver, right? If I give you something, i.e. the seller gives you the responsibility to act as their agent to sell their house, then they take it back, they're revoking it, they're like an Indian giver. Again, it kind of sucks, but do you want to be right or do you want to be happy? And it's usually not worth suing a seller if they've signed a listing agreement with you for 6 months and they break it after 2 months. Again, it's not all up to you. Your broker has to agree to sue, and I would always discuss that. Take that to your broker and explain the situation, and let your broker decide what to do. I mean, it's not happened to me, but I think if it would happen to me, somebody says, we sign a 6-month listing agreement, they call me up at 4 months and say, hey, I'm just not getting enough action here. I really don't want to work with you anymore. I'd like to terminate. I wouldn't fight it. I would say, sure, let me bring over a release. I'd take a release to them, and I would actually ask them to tell me what, obviously I didn't live up to your expectations. Is there something different that I could have done? What could I have done to not have disappointed you? And I try to use it as a learning situation. And then I would just go out and hopefully learn from it and move on. Now, what if you're faced with a situation? I list a house with an acquaintance, and I've got it listed for 2 months, and she calls me up and says, hey, I don't know if I really want to sell my house anymore, so how about if you just let me out of the contract? And I'm like, well, what's going on? I don't understand. You were pretty gun-ho. What's changed? Well, kind of met this new guy, and he's a real estate agent. I'd like to list with him. Now that I might pursue a little bit more. Again, I don't think I'd ever sue over it. I'd probably talk to her and say, listen, I've spent some time on this. I've spent some money on this. I get that you've just met this person, but who happens to be an agent, but we did sign an agreement and it is legally binding. And, and if I really can't talk that person out of it, I would say, well, then it kind of makes sense that you at least reimburse me for my actual costs that I have involved in this. And you might get there and you might not. Again, it's not worth it to me to pursue that, but I do understand where some people may want to pursue that. So revocation or renunciation of a listing agreement is a termination of an agency relationship, but it doesn't necessarily not have any legal consequences. Let's talk about opinion versus fact, and there's 3 terms that go with that. We can talk about, just again, I just like to talk about an opinion. You can say something like, in my opinion, this is the best house in the neighborhood. That's an okay thing to say if you really think it's the best. I mean, don't look around and it'd be the shabbiest house and say something like that. But an opinion is an okay thing to say. And, compared to the sale prices of other houses in this area, I think this is a great listing price. That's an opinion, and that's an okay thing to say. Predictions are okay too, if they're based on fact. You can say something like historically, the houses in this neighborhood have increased 3% a year for the past 5 years. If that's truly the statistical facts, that's an okay thing to say. And you can even go on and say, and I see no reason why it won't continue. That's a prediction, and that is an okay thing to say when you are representing a buyer or a seller. And puffing, it's kind of exaggeration. It's what every salesperson should do, or should say almost every salesperson. You go in, show a buyer a house, and you go into the kitchen and you open up the sliding glass doors. You say, look at this beautiful big backyard, and it might even be kind of a postage stamp, but it's all tree lined and there's trees all behind there because it happens to back up to a park. There's nothing wrong with saying it's beautiful. It's kind of an opinion. Exaggerating a little bit is okay. Now, if that person says, what? Is the property line on this house, does that include all those trees? Well, of course, then you've got to tell them no, but it backs up to a park. It's always going to be here. It's always going to be a beautiful backyard. All of those types of things are okay. But what's not okay is fraud. And then you need to understand the difference between actual fraud and implied fraud or unintentional fraud. So actual fraud basically is an action where you are misrepresenting something, and that can be in actual words or lies, if you will, or it can be by non-disclosure of certain things. Okay, and I'm trying to find this here. So actual fraud is intentional fraud, and the definition of that is on page 178 under opinion versus fact, the second paragraph there. And then negligent misrepresentation, I don't think the book talks about it, but that's, you need to know for testing purpose, that's called constructive fraud. It is not perhaps where you actually lie, but there is a misrepresentation of a fact, either affirmatively or by not stating something, and it's really done in negligence. So somebody says something like, you're looking at a piece of property and with a buyer, and they say, well, I see that this is a septic system here. Can this be hooked up to a public sewer system? Oh, sure. There's no reason why I don't see that, why that wouldn't happen, why that couldn't happen. That really is negligent fraud or constructive fraud. You're held to a duty of being a professional and an expert. You cannot just be saying something that you have no clear understanding of. Okay, so make sure you understand the difference between intentional fraud, which is also known as actual fraud, and constructive fraud, which is unintentional fraud for purposes of testing. And then we talk about latent defects. Again, I know I've said this 100 times, but I'm going to say it again. Under Ohio law, latent defects have to be disclosed by the seller and by the seller's agent. If the basement leaks and you have knowledge of that, you have to disclose that. And whether that's the best place to do that is on MLS in the notes section. Basement irregularly leaks when, or there's water occasionally in the basement when strong rainstorms hit, something to that effect. And that's the best place to put it, so that you could never be accused of not disclosing a latent defect if you put it there. You can sometimes disclose that to every seller's agent when they submit a purchase contract to you as well. I personally think that's a little late to be disclosing that, but and the seller should also be disclosing that in their property disclosure statement that we're going to talk about here in a bit, but sellers aren't always willing to do that. Let's talk briefly about stigmatized properties. Crimes, suicides, murders, meth labs. I'm not sure. I really don't know where the meth lab thing is in Ohio. I think that was changing. I think you have to disclose that if you know that there was a meth lab there. But in Ohio, you do not need to disclose suicides or murders that happen in a house. If you know about that or there's any indication of that, I would talk to if you're representing the seller, I would talk to the seller directly about that. And if they, I would ask them permission whether you can disclose that or not. Personally, I always think that if somebody asked a question, it's better to disclose it than, because if they eventually find out about it, you may be working the deal for 6 weeks, and 3 days before closing, a buyer finds out about it and they refuse to close. That's just not good for anybody. So again, I'm an open book. I don't think there's anything wrong with disclosing. I say over disclose, but certainly if you're representing a seller, you need to ask that seller whether they're okay. Again, I had a situation, it was my property in Pleasant Ridge. The lady, it was the first guy we bought the house or we listed the house for, who had the crazy wife. He called us up 2 years later and said he had his house to list, and we were a little confused, and it was his ex-wife's house. He said that she had passed away, and that his sons were both 20-something in college, and he was named as the administrator, and he was selling the house on their behalf. And then he asked about, whether he needed to disclose anything like a suicide. So we talked about it, and he was okay if we disclosed it. Not that we wanted to put it on MLS, but if somebody asked the question, he said that we were okay. He was okay with us indicating that his ex-wife had passed away there. At that point, they hadn't had the autopsy results, but it looked like it was an OD. At least, it wasn't violent or anything, but so that still kind of freaks people out. To me, people die in houses all the time, but in any event, in our particular situation, she bought the house like July 3rd, and we were listing the house like August 23rd. So it was a very short period of time when she owned the house, and we were listing it for the same price she bought it for. So we had a lot of questions from buyers as to why the quick sale. And so we just simply said, the owner had passed away unexpectedly. And if anybody asked any further questions, we followed up and answered it. And I think that's the best way to handle that situation. So, Megan's Law, that's with the, pedophiles and things like that with children. Again, that is addressed in the property disclosure in Ohio, and it just says that basically a buyer has it's his responsibility to do his own investigation into that. You may have clients that ask you about that. I would give them websites and numbers, police numbers, agency numbers to call to check on that. If you so much as want to do that for your client, that's okay. But it's not your obligation to actually do that. All right, so now I'm moving into Chapter 11, and we're talking about listing agreements and for sellers and buyer representation agreements. We did touch base on this last week, and I know I asked, talked about the advantages of having a buyer representation agreement. So I'm not going to repeat any of that again, but there are a few things we need to go through here. There are 4 different types of listing agreements that you do need to be aware of for testing purposes, and I guess somewhat for real life. The first one is exclusive right to sell. That is the one that you will typically use, and basically once you sign that with the seller, you are entitled to be paid a commission no matter who's involved in the sale of the house during the time period that the agency or the relationship is created, which is the term of the listing agreement. By the way, in Ohio, or at least in this area, most listing agreements are signed for a 6-month period. So if a seller calls you up and you go over and do your presentation, they agree to use you, they call you back the next day, say, I decided I'm going to use you. You go over, you have them fill out all the forms. It's a Friday night, you put a for sale sign in their yard, and you have plans of putting it into MLS on Monday morning. Then the seller's brother stops over his house that night to have a beer with him and sees the for sale sign and says, man, I didn't know you were selling. Wow, you should have told me, because my next door neighbor's dying to get into this neighborhood, and I bet he'd be really interested in your house. So they talk to each other all weekend and decide that this is what they're going to do. And if the seller thinks that, well, the agent didn't do anything but put a for sale sign in my yard. I'm just, we'll sign our own little contract over here, and I'll call the agent up on Monday, and we'll cancel. Well, he can do that, but the agent is still entitled to his commission, okay? Which it really, a lot of people think that's unfair. I don't think that's unfair, because there's a lot of things that can happen along the way, and basically, I don't know if I would call he was the procuring cause or not, but once somebody signs an exclusive right to sell listing, and it is sold, and even if it has nothing to do with that broker or that agent, that broker/agent is entitled to the commission. Okay? And then the second one is exclusive agency listing, and that says that's basically the seller is saying, I agree that I am going to deal with your brokerage exclusively and no other brokerage. It acts the same way as the exclusive right to sell listing, except if the seller brings in his own buyer, then the commission is not owed. So we go back to the situation I just talked about. Then in that situation, the agent/broker would not be owed a commission. Okay? Basically, everything else is the same. An open listing is a non-exclusive listing where a seller makes an agreement with a number of different brokerages. 5 different brokerages. Hey, you want to list my house? List my house on MLS. And I'm listing it with a bunch of other people, a bunch of other brokers too. And whoever sells it first, they get the deal. They get the commission. So I've never been exposed to that on either end, but that is a type of, it's kind of competitive. It's kind of, I guess it all depends on, where the house is, how quickly it's going to sell, how competitive your nature is as an agent. Some agents might find that, enticing to let me compete against the best out there, and I bet I can get this. And then the last one is net listing. It is not legal in all states. Do understand it is legal in Ohio, and it's kind of frowned upon, but it is legal in Ohio, and that's where the seller says, you come in to list my house, and I tell you, listen, I've lived here for 20 years. It's really not been updated. I don't want to lose money on it, but I don't really need, to make a certain amount of money out of this. My house is paid off. How about you list it for whatever you want? I just want to walk away with $200,000 even. And in that situation, that is called a net listing. If you sell it for $250, your commission's $50. I get my $200. If you sell it for $199, I'm not going to sell it. If you sell it for $205, your commission is $5. I get the $200. Okay, so again, that is legal in Ohio, but a little bit frowned upon because you think about how you could take advantage of some people who are not educated in the value of their house, and some agents could really take advantage of some people in that situation. Well, let me see if there's anything else here we talked about. Okay, let's talk about expirations of the listing period. In Ohio, you need a expiration period, and again, usually it's 6 months, but it doesn't have to be. It can be whatever you want. When you're filling it out, the form will have a blank. The term of this listing agreement will expire on blank. Under law, if you leave that blank, it's kind of viewed by a court to be this goes on forever and ever. So, but it gives you an opportunity as an agent or broker to take advantage of somebody. If you leave it blank and then it's month 7 and they say, hey man, I'm not getting any showings on my house. What are you doing here? I want to terminate and list with somebody else who I think can do a better job. You could like wave that listing agreement in front of their face basically and say, look, you signed this with me. There's no termination date in here. So I have the right to list this house until we sell it. And the state of Ohio doesn't want us to be able to take advantage of people in that situation. So there is a law, Ohio law says there has to be an expiration date on every listing agreement. So on the exam, let's go back to the statute of frauds. Remember, it says which contracts have to be in writing in order to be enforced. In Ohio, anything that cannot be fully executed or fully performed within a year has to be in writing. All contracts dealing with the transfer of real estate have to be in writing. So those two things would relate. First off, let's go to the first one. If it's under a year, the statute of frauds would not dictate that a listing agreement has to be in writing, and it is not a listing agreement. Remember, is not dealing with a transfer of real estate. It is basically an employment agreement. It's talking about real estate, but the contract is, I am engaging you to sell my house and I will pay you a commission. It is not actually transferring the real estate itself. So for testing purposes, it is not the statute of frauds that dictates that a listing agreement be in writing, but it's basically statutory and regulatory administrative law that says it has to be in writing because, one, under Ohio, you have to have the expiration date in writing, and you also have to provide in writing to the seller the name of the broker and all of its contact information. Okay. And we're talking on page 196 about all of the information needed for a listing agreement. You can read through that, but I mean, it is a lot of information. You've got to get the seller prepared, and you need a lot of details, and it's just not going in there and signing a one-page document. You need lots of information here, and so there's some footwork that's required on the seller side, and then some education on your side to walk your client through what's going to be needed. They've got some form of some listing agreements in here. I'll try to post a form for you too, kind of what we use. Let's see. We've talked about personal property fixtures. You definitely list in there what I always address appliances, whether they stay or not. And then if there's any other property that's not deemed to be personal property that the seller's going to take, that's the place to list it as well. Let's talk about the buyer protection clause. That's a clause in a listing agreement, and they're all a little different, that basically says that if the broker/agent was the procuring cause, remember the first event in a chain of events that causes the sale of the property to happen, and it happens within a relatively short period of time after the listing agreement expires, then the original broker agent is entitled to be paid a commission. So again, if your listing agreement is for 6 months, somebody comes and looks at the house during month 5, but they're just at the beginning of their looking stage and they're not ready to make a commitment yet. Your 6 months expiration comes and they go and list the house with another agent, or perhaps they don't list the house at all. And then that person that looked at the house in month 5 looks at 20 different houses and said, I really want to go back and look at that first house that we saw. If they go back and they see that it's not for sale, they knock on the door, and they they work out a deal, then within a relatively short period of time, I mean, it can't be years later, then the original broker slash agent is entitled to be paid a commission. So as an agent and you have listings that expire, you should kind of track some of those to see what's happening with them. Sometimes it's hard to prove that, whether you were the procuring clause and somebody actually looked at it or the action was initiated under your watch, but it's certainly worth taking care of or looking after. All right, we talked about buyer representation agreements last week. All right, on page 214 is the residential property disclosure form that must be filled out in Ohio, and you should get your seller to sign it and fill it out at the listing appointment once they agree to go with you. It is required by Ohio law to be filled out by every seller of a unit of a house, residential property of 1 to 4 units. There are some exceptions to who has to fill this out in Ohio. I don't think you'll be tested on those, and I don't see those in the book, but perhaps I know like one exception is if you lease the property for over 12 months in Ohio and now you're buying it, the seller does not need to fill this out and give this to you. Because in reality, if you've lived there for a year, you probably know a little bit more about the house than maybe even the owner does. If you are selling the house on behalf of an estate, you're the executor or the administrator, then you do not need to fill this out because you don't necessarily have any personal knowledge of these facts relevant to the house. I can tell you what is not an exception, and that's if you're an investor and never lived in the house. A lot of investors, flippers, contest and say that they're not obligated to fill this out because they've never lived in the house, so they don't have any knowledge of these matters. Well, I'd be the first one to argue that as a flipper, they probably have more knowledge about the house than anybody, because if they've gone in and done any renovation, they should know many of these facts intimately. So what happens if they don't fill this out? If you should get your seller to fill this out, and then you should post it on MLS. And so that if somebody looks at the MLS listing, thinks I want to go see it, they can go up to the documents file or the tab, open it up and read it. There's some people that I have that say, I don't even want to look at a house that has water in the basement. I've been there, done that before, not willing to do it again. And so I read it. If it says there's any, even occasionally the basement gets wet, then we don't even go look at the house. Okay? But so it should be posted on MLS, but a lot of times it's not done in a timely manner. So your client wants to look at it, you go look at it, they're interested, they want to put an offer in. I would pick up the phone and call the agent and ask them for a property disclosure. They may, I don't know what they may say. They may just say they haven't gotten around to doing it yet, or whatever. If your client really wants the house, they can put an offer in. But Ohio law says that they can, again, request the property disclosure and they say that we're going to do inspections, and they have to be done in 10 days. And then we're going to close in 40 days, and it's subject to appraisal and all of that. Say the seller gets the property disclosure to the buyer on day 9. So inspections come and go, and they're okay with the inspections. The buyer has 3 business days after receipt of the property disclosure to walk away from the contract based upon the property disclosure, no questions asked. So it gives the buyer an out if it is delivered late. Otherwise, if it's not delivered at all, the buyer has up to 30 days after the contract was signed or actual closing to walk away. Again, let's play this out, that inspections in 10 days and closing in 40 days, and there's financing and all of that. The buyer would have up until day 30 after the contract was signed to walk away because they were never given the property disclosure. They couldn't wait until closing because the 30 days have come and gone. But if you have a cash buyer and they're going to close in 20 days, then, you know, and the buyer actually has up to the date of closing to terminate for no reason, based on the fact they haven't gotten this, they can't, you know, undo the deal 10 days later. So it's the earlier of 30 days or closing. So a lot of times what you'll see is on the first page they'll just put owner is investor, owner never lived here, and then they'll sign and date the last page but won't fill it out. That's not a delivery of a property disclosure statement. Okay. You need, most of your brokers will tell you not to put your John Hancock on here anywhere. Don't fill this out for your client. Your client's going to have a lot of questions on it. You can talk to your client about it. I always say over disclose, over disclose, over disclose. If you have a question about whether you should disclose it, let's just disclose it. Okay. It says specifically in the instructions it's to be filled out by the seller, so don't sit there and fill this out. If you have somebody elderly or something like that, then you're going to have to make an exception. But they should be filling this out. And, you know, they just ask about water, leaks, environmental, sewage system, boundary lines, everything across the board. Note that you have to fill in the property address on every page. You have to have the seller and the buyer. When the buyer fills out the contract, if they've already received the property disclosure and it's on MLS, they need to sign this as well, and they need to initial every page so that nobody can go in and switch pages. This is not in lieu of having a buyer do their own inspection. A buyer should always do their own inspection. This is just a seller, it's an opportunity for a seller to disclose latent defects. Okay. There are a number of questions here that talk about, do you know of any previous or current leaks? Other times they just may say, do you know of any current leaks? So you really do need to read and highlight for your clients what those things are. And again, fill out every question, and you fill it out like you fill out the lead-based paint thing. Only if it's, when the seller's filling out, it's to their actual knowledge, not what they guess, not what they think, but, you know, have you ever had water in the basement? Current or previous within the last 5 years. And if there was water in the basement, but it's been fixed, then I would put, you know, had water in basement, had it corrected by blank on approximately blank, and put that information down there. You know, if you have an older house and your seller fills this out and everything is no, everything's perfect, well, more than likely that seller's a liar. Shouldn't say that, but, you know, there's no house that's perfect, and I guess I feel more comfortable reading one that says, yes, prior issue here, but fixed it on this date by doing this. That makes me feel better because I know that they're I think disclosing accurately what has happened there. All right, so that's it. I didn't spend much time on this video on this chapter, but we covered a lot of that last week. Please read that entire chapter as well as chapter 10 and focus on the last sections which deal with Ohio on both of those. And then I'll do it right now. I'll go on and put all those forms on there so you can take a look at that. So have a great week. And I will see you a week from this coming Tuesday. Bye for now.